March 3, 1945. Captain Takeshi Yamada of the Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Area Defense Command pressed his body deeper into the limestone cave as another wave of aircraft roared overhead. For 3 weeks, his regiment had occupied these fortified positions in the mountainous jungle terrain of northern Luzon, transforming every ridge, every cave, every tree line into an interconnected fortress that Japanese High Command declared impregnable. The Americans would come, yes, but they would bleed for every meter of advance. They would exhaust themselves against concrete bunkers and interlocking firing positions. They would stumble into killing zones where Japanese machine gunners had already calculated every angle of fire. Captain Yamada had fought the Americans before at Leyte, had watched them struggle through tropical terrain, had seen their advances slow to a crawl when faced with determined resistance from well-prepared defensive positions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But something was different this morning. The American fighter bombers that had been harassing Japanese positions for days were flying in tighter formations, coming in lower, their approach more deliberate. Through his field glasses, Yamada watched as the lead aircraft began their attack runs against the western ridge where Colonel Matsumoto's battalion had dug in among the dense mahogany forests and tangled undergrowth. What happened next would fundamentally alter everything Captain Yamada thought he understood about modern warfare. The first aircraft released what appeared to be standard bombs, tumbling through the humid air toward the jungle canopy below. But these projectiles did not detonate on impact. Instead, they burst open perhaps 20 meters above the treetops, releasing a cascading waterfall of thick, gelatinous substance that seemed to cling to everything it touched. Within seconds, the entire western ridge erupted into flames unlike anything Yamada had ever witnessed. This was not the brief flash of high explosive or the concentrated burn of white phosphorus. This was something that spread like living oil, that stuck to trees and flowed into caves and dripped from branches still burning. The fire did not consume and extinguish. It adhered and multiplied. Flames raced along the forest canopy, jumped between trees, poured down into the ravines where Japanese soldiers had thought themselves protected by overhead cover. The screaming started almost immediately. Men emerged from bunkers and caves, their uniforms ablaze with flames that water could not extinguish. Soldiers rolled on the ground trying to smother fires that simply spread to whatever they touched. The thick black smoke that rose from the burning jungle carried with it a smell that Yamada would never forget, a mixture of burning rubber, gasoline, and something organic that made his stomach turn. Within 15 minutes, the entire western ridge had become an inferno. Trees that had stood for centuries were transformed into towering torches. Underground positions that Japanese engineers had spent weeks fortifying became ovens as fire consumed the oxygen and superheated air penetrated every tunnel and chamber. What Captain Yamada was witnessing was the combat debut of an American weapon that would transform jungle warfare in the Pacific Theater. A weapon so effective at neutralizing fortified positions that it would force Japanese defenders to completely reconsider their strategic assumptions about defensive warfare. The substance coating the western ridge and turning it into hell on earth was napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture that represented the fusion of chemistry and military necessity. What made this weapon particularly devastating was not merely its ability to start fires, which conventional incendiaries could also accomplish, but its persistence, its adherence, and its capacity to penetrate into spaces where traditional explosives were ineffective. The story of how napalm came to burn across the jungles of the Pacific begins not in combat laboratories or military proving grounds, but in the chemistry department of Harvard University in 1942. A team of scientists led by Professor Louis Fieser had been tasked by the United States military with solving a specific tactical problem. American forces needed an effective incendiary weapon that could be deployed against enemy installations, industrial targets, and military positions. Existing incendiaries had significant limitations. Standard gasoline bombs dispersed too quickly and burned too fast to be effective against hardened targets. Thermite charges were effective but difficult to disperse over large areas. White phosphorus was useful but unpredictable and difficult to control. Professor Fieser and his team experimented with various compounds that could thicken gasoline, transforming it from a liquid that evaporated rapidly into a gel that would stick to surfaces and burn for extended periods. The breakthrough came when they combined aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids with gasoline, creating a substance that was thick enough to adhere to surfaces but still liquid enough to be loaded into standard bomb casings and dispersed effectively from aircraft. The name napalm itself came from the combination of naphthenic and palmitic, the two key acids in the original formulation. By 1943, American forces were conducting tests of napalm weapons at proving grounds in Utah and Florida, evaluating their effectiveness against various target types. Initial combat deployment of napalm occurred in the European theater and in the China-Burma-India theater during 1944, but these early uses were limited and primarily focused on attacking fixed installations and industrial targets. The true potential of napalm as a tactical weapon against fortified jungle positions was not fully recognized until American forces began confronting the defensive strategies that Japanese forces had perfected by late 1944. Japanese defensive doctrine by this stage of the war had evolved considerably from the aggressive offensive tactics that characterized earlier campaigns. Having suffered catastrophic losses in attempts to counterattack and overwhelm American forces through sheer audacity, Japanese commanders had shifted to a defensive strategy that emphasized prepared positions, extensive fortifications, and the exploitation of terrain to negate American advantages in firepower and mobility. This defensive transformation was particularly evident in the Philippines campaign that began in October 1944. When American forces landed at Leyte Gulf and began advancing inland, they encountered Japanese defensive positions unlike anything they had faced in earlier Pacific campaigns. These were not hasty field fortifications thrown up during retreats. These were carefully engineered defensive complexes that had been months or even years in preparation. Japanese engineers had become masters at exploiting the natural advantages of tropical terrain. Limestone caves, common throughout the Philippines and other Pacific islands, were expanded into interconnected tunnel systems with multiple entrances, ventilation shafts, and supply chambers. Concrete bunkers were positioned on reverse slopes where they could not be effectively targeted by naval gunfire or air bombardment. Machine gun positions were sited to create interlocking fields of fire across any possible avenue of approach. The jungle vegetation itself became part of the defensive system. Dense undergrowth concealed pillboxes and spider holes until attackers were within grenade range. Trees and vines were left intact above fortified positions, providing natural camouflage that made aerial observation nearly impossible. Ravines and stream beds that appeared to be natural terrain features were actually carefully prepared killing zones with pre-positioned artillery coordinates and hidden firing positions covering every meter. What made these defensive positions particularly frustrating for American commanders was their resistance to conventional bombardment. Naval gunfire, which had been devastatingly effective in supporting amphibious landings, could not reach positions on reverse slopes or inside caves. Artillery barrages that would obliterate open field positions had minimal effect against concrete and earth-covered bunkers. Even direct hits from heavy-caliber shells often failed to neutralize cave positions, as the blast effects dissipated into the open air rather than penetrating deep into the tunnel systems. American infantry advancing against these positions faced a nightmare scenario. They could not see their enemy until fire erupted from concealed positions at close range. Flanking maneuvers were channeled into prepared kill zones. Attempts to reduce individual bunkers with satchel charges or flamethrowers required soldiers to close to suicidal ranges under fire from supporting positions. The jungle itself limited visibility to a few meters, preventing the kind of coordinated fire and maneuver tactics that American forces had perfected in more open terrain. Casualties mounted steadily as rifle companies and battalions ground forward meter by meter against prepared defenses. By early 1945, American commanders were desperately seeking tactical solutions to the problem of reducing Japanese fortified positions without incurring prohibitive casualties. The answer would come not from new infantry tactics or heavier artillery, but from chemistry and air power working in combination. The Philippine campaign had revealed the tactical problem. Luzon would provide the testing ground for the solution. Northern Luzon in early 1945 presented Japanese defenders with nearly ideal terrain for the kind of defensive warfare they had perfected. The region was dominated by the Cordillera Central, a mountain range running north to south with peaks exceeding 2,000 meters. The mountains were covered in triple canopy jungle interspersed with hardwood forests and dense bamboo thickets. Rivers and streams carved deep ravines through the terrain. Limestone formations provided abundant natural caves. The climate was tropical highland, meaning constant precipitation, persistent cloud cover, and vegetation so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, had recognized northern Luzon as the key to prolonging Japanese resistance. Unable to defend Manila or the Central Plains against overwhelming American firepower and mobility, Yamashita had withdrawn the bulk of his remaining forces into the mountains where terrain would negate American advantages. Here, Japanese soldiers could fight a defensive campaign that would tie down American divisions and delay the inevitable conclusion of the Philippine campaign. Yamashita's Shobu Group, as his northern force was designated, numbered approximately 152,000 troops, though many of these were support personnel, naval troops reassigned as infantry, and Filipino conscripts of dubious reliability. Nevertheless, this represented a formidable force occupying terrain that heavily favored the defender. The Japanese defensive plan for northern Luzon was comprehensive and sophisticated. Major defensive lines were established along natural terrain features, with the primary line running along the Villa Verde Trail, a mountain track that provided one of the few routes through the Cordillera Central. Secondary positions were prepared in depth throughout the mountains, ensuring that even if one defensive line was breached, subsequent positions would force attackers to repeat the entire process of reducing fortified positions under fire. Supply dumps were distributed throughout the mountains, hidden in caves and buried in camouflaged locations. Japanese engineers had months to prepare these positions, and they had used the time well. Every approach route was covered by interlocking fire from concrete pillboxes reinforced with logs and earth. Artillery positions were located in positions that protected them from counter-battery fire. Mortar pits were positioned on reverse slopes where they could drop shells on American positions without exposing themselves to return fire. The fortifications themselves represented the pinnacle of Japanese defensive engineering. Bunkers were constructed using reinforced concrete, where cement was available, or logs and earth where it was not. Firing ports were narrow slits that provided minimal target area while allowing defenders clear fields of fire. Many positions had multiple firing ports covering different approaches, allowing defenders to shift position if one port was suppressed. Interconnecting trenches and tunnels allowed defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves to fire. The cave systems were particularly formidable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Natural limestone caves were expanded and improved with multiple chambers serving different functions. Forward chambers housed fighting positions with machine guns and light mortars. Deeper chambers stored ammunition, supplies, and provided shelter during bombardments. Many cave systems had multiple entrances at different elevations, allowing defenders to withdraw from one entrance under pressure while reinforcements moved up through alternate routes. American intelligence officers studying aerial photographs and interrogating captured soldiers gradually developed a picture of what they would face in northern Luzon. The assessment was sobering. Conventional infantry tactics would work, but slowly and at tremendous cost. Artillery preparation, no matter how intensive, would leave the majority of fortified positions intact. Naval gunfire support was impossible in the mountains. The dense jungle canopy prevented effective aerial observation, making close air support difficult to coordinate. Senior American commanders recognized that new tactics would be required. The solution would come from combining a relatively new weapon with an old problem. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Scott, operations officer for the 5th Air Force, had been studying reports of napalm effectiveness in other theaters. In Europe, napalm had been used effectively against fortified positions, though results were mixed depending on target construction and delivery accuracy. In Burma, napalm strikes against Japanese positions in jungle terrain had shown promising results, though the scale of employment had been limited. Scott recognized that the conditions in northern Luzon were ideally suited for napalm employment. The dense jungle vegetation would allow napalm to spread through the forest canopy, creating fires that would persist for hours. The interconnected cave systems that made positions nearly invulnerable to conventional explosives could become death traps when fire consumed the oxygen and filled tunnels with superheated air and toxic smoke. The challenge was logistical and tactical. Napalm bombs required specialized manufacturing facilities and specific mixing procedures. The thickening agents had to be combined with gasoline in precise ratios to achieve the proper consistency. Too thick and the mixture would not disperse effectively. Too thin and it would burn too quickly without the persistent adherence that made napalm so effective. Once mixed, napalm bombs had to be loaded into aircraft and delivered with precision against specific targets. The 5th Air Force began receiving shipments of napalm components in late 1944 and established mixing facilities at airfields throughout Luzon. Fighter-bomber squadrons that had previously focused on strafing and conventional bombing runs received training in napalm delivery techniques. The tactical employment of napalm required different approach profiles than conventional bombing. Napalm was most effective when delivered from relatively low altitude, typically between 500 and 2,000 feet, in a shallow dive that allowed the bomb to strike the target area and disperse the jellied gasoline across a wide area. Pilots had to balance the need for accuracy, which required lower altitude approaches, against the danger from ground fire and the need to pull up before their own aircraft were caught in the blast effects. By March 1945, everything was in place for the first large-scale employment of napalm against Japanese fortified jungle positions in northern Luzon. American ground forces of the 32nd Infantry Division were preparing to advance along the Villa Verde Trail, directly into the teeth of Japanese defenses that had been prepared for months. Intelligence estimates suggested the advance would take weeks and cost thousands of casualties. The napalm strikes planned to support the offensive would either validate the new weapon as a decisive tactical tool or prove to be merely another incremental improvement in the grinding attrition of jungle warfare. Captain Yamada and his regiment occupying the Western Ridge approaches had no conception of what was about to be unleashed against them. They had endured naval bombardment before. They had survived artillery barrages that turned the earth into moonscapes. They had fought through American airstrikes that cratered roads and demolished buildings. But nothing in their experience, nothing in their training, nothing in their understanding of warfare had prepared them for what napalm would do to fortified jungle positions. The substance that was about to transform their defensive fortress into a crematorium represented a fundamental change in the character of jungle warfare. It was not merely a more powerful explosive or a more accurate bomb. It was a weapon that attacked the very foundations of Japanese defensive doctrine by eliminating the protection that caves and bunkers provided, by turning dense vegetation from an asset into a liability, and by creating conditions where courage and determination were irrelevant against environmental effects that could not be resisted through willpower alone. The engineers who had spent months fortifying the Western Ridge had created what they believed was an impenetrable defensive position. Interlocking bunkers covered every approach. Machine guns were positioned with overlapping fields of fire. Artillery spotters had pre-plotted coordinates for every possible avenue of American advance. Supply tunnels connected fighting positions to ammunition storage caves. Ventilation shafts provided fresh air to underground chambers. Medical stations were established in the deepest caves where wounded could be treated in relative safety. The entire complex represented the culmination of Japanese defensive engineering, a fortress that would force American attackers to pay in blood for every meter of advance. Within the next few hours, this masterpiece of defensive preparation would be transformed into a landscape of flame and death that would shatter every assumption about the superiority of prepared defenses against determined attackers. The morning of March 10, 1945 began with what Japanese defenders along the Villa Verde Trail had come to recognize as routine harassment. American artillery opened fire at dawn, lobbing shells into suspected Japanese positions with the methodical persistence that characterized American operations. Colonel Hideaki Matsumoto, commanding the 361st Independent Infantry Battalion, barely glanced up from his morning rice as explosions rumbled through the valleys below his command bunker. His positions had endured 6 days of preparatory bombardment already. The concrete and log bunkers his engineers had constructed absorbed the punishment with minimal damage. A few positions had taken direct hits and been temporarily knocked out, but redundant firing positions meant that the defensive integrity remained intact. Matsumoto's confidence in his defensive scheme was absolute. The Americans would come, and they would die in the approaches just as they had died at every other fortified position throughout the Philippines. What Colonel Matsumoto did not know was that the artillery barrage was merely preparatory fire designed to keep Japanese defenders underground while American aircraft assembled for an entirely different kind of attack. At Lingayen Airfield, 40 P-38 Lightning fighter bombers of the 475th Fighter Group were being loaded with ordnance that ground crews handled with unusual care. Each aircraft carried 2 165-gallon napalm tanks suspended under the wings. The tanks themselves were modified drop tanks, standard auxiliary fuel containers that had been repurposed to carry the jellied gasoline mixture. The triggering mechanism was elegantly simple. A white phosphorus igniter attached to the nose of each tank would detonate on impact, instantly igniting the napalm as it dispersed across the target area. The pilots who would deliver these weapons had received specific briefing on the target complex and the desired approach profile. Major Thomas Harrison, squadron commander, gathered his pilots for final instructions. The target was a ridgeline approximately 8 kilometers northwest of American front-line positions. Intelligence had identified the ridge as a major defensive strongpoint with an estimated battalion strength of Japanese defenders occupying interconnected bunker and cave complexes. Previous conventional bombing runs had produced minimal observable results. The objective today was not merely to suppress the position but to completely neutralize it through sustained fire that would make the defensive works untenable. Harrison emphasized the importance of accuracy and timing. The first wave would strike the northern slope, establishing the initial conflagration. Subsequent waves would hit the southern approaches and the ridge crest itself, creating overlapping zones of fire that would prevent defenders from escaping the affected areas. The weather was ideal for the mission. Clear skies with unlimited visibility and minimal wind. The P-38s lifted off in pairs, formed up over the airfield, and turned northwest toward the target area. They climbed to 8,000 feet for the transit flight, high enough to be outside effective range of Japanese anti-aircraft fire but low enough that the pilots maintained clear visual reference to the jungle terrain below. The flight took 17 minutes. As they approached the target area, Harrison ordered the formation to split into 3 groups. The first group of 12 aircraft would make the initial attack run from north to south. The second group would follow 3 minutes later, attacking from east to west. The final group would hold at altitude, ready to strike targets of opportunity or reinforce areas where initial strikes appeared less effective. Harrison led the first group into their attack run. He rolled into a shallow dive, descending toward the ridgeline that stretched below him like a green serpent coiled among the mountains. At 2,000 feet he could see individual trees in the dense canopy. At 1,500 feet he could distinguish the lighter green of bamboo thickets from the darker green of hardwood forest. At 1,000 feet he pickled off both napalm tanks and immediately pulled up, banking hard right to clear the area for the following aircraft. The tanks tumbled through the air, their white phosphorus igniters flashing bright even in the morning sunlight as they struck the jungle canopy and burst open. The jellied gasoline sprayed outward in a fan pattern, coating trees, undergrowth, and everything within a radius of 30 meters. The phosphorus ignited the napalm instantly, and within seconds a wall of flame was racing through the forest. 11 more P-38s followed Harrison's attack run, each releasing their napalm tanks in a carefully spaced pattern that created a continuous line of fire across the northern slope of the ridge. From Harrison's vantage point at 5,000 feet, the effect was spectacular. The green jungle canopy transformed into orange and black as flames consumed vegetation and thick smoke began rising in columns that would eventually reach thousands of feet into the air. But the true devastation was occurring beneath the canopy where Japanese defenders were experiencing the nightmare that Captain Yamada had witnessed days earlier. Private First Class Kenji Tanaka was in a forward bunker when the napalm struck. He heard the aircraft approaching and pressed himself against the concrete wall, waiting for the explosions that would signal another bombing run. Instead, he heard a strange whooshing sound followed by the roar of flames. Within seconds, the temperature inside the bunker became unbearable. The firing ports that provided ventilation now admitted superheated air that seared his lungs with each breath. Tanaka stumbled toward the rear exit of the bunker, but the tunnel was already filled with smoke so thick he could not see. He could hear screaming from other positions, could smell burning wood and something worse. His uniform began smoking from the radiant heat. He made it perhaps 10 meters into the tunnel before the lack of oxygen forced him to crawl. 5 meters further and he collapsed, his last conscious thought a confused question about how fire could penetrate so deeply into the earth. Lieutenant Saburo Nakamura commanded a platoon position in a cave complex on the southern slope. When the first napalm strikes hit the northern side of the ridge, he felt only relief that his positions were not directly targeted. That relief lasted approximately 3 minutes, until the second wave of P-38s rolled into their attack runs and began dropping napalm across the southern approaches. Nakamura watched through binoculars as the jellied gasoline cascaded through the trees. He ordered his men deeper into the caves, believing the rock and earth above them would provide protection. For perhaps 30 seconds, this assumption seemed correct. Then the fire reached the cave entrance. Napalm that had adhered to trees and vegetation around the cave mouth continued burning, and the flames were drawn into the cave by the draft created by ventilation shafts. The fire did not penetrate far into the cave itself, but it did not need to. The flames consumed the oxygen at the cave entrance, and the superheated air and toxic smoke penetrated deep into the tunnel system. Men who had survived previous bombardments by sheltering in the deepest chambers now found themselves choking on smoke that filled every passage. Some attempted to reach alternate exits but found those blocked by fire as well. Others tried to wait out the flames, wrapping wet cloth around their faces to filter the smoke. But the napalm fires burned for 10, 15, 20 minutes, far longer than any conventional incendiary. The temperature inside the caves climbed steadily. Men began passing out from heat exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. Some made desperate attempts to escape through the flames at cave entrances. Most died in the tunnels, asphyxiated by smoke or overcome by heat. Colonel Matsumoto and his command bunker received fragmentary reports from surviving observation posts about the nature of the attack. The Americans were using some new type of fire weapon. Entire slopes were burning. Cave positions were being abandoned. Units were out of communication. Matsumoto attempted to organize a withdrawal to secondary positions further up the ridge, but movement was nearly impossible. The jungle that had provided concealment and protection was now a sea of flame. Soldiers attempting to move through the burning forest were forced back by walls of fire. The few trails that were not actively burning were choked with smoke so dense that visibility dropped to arm's length. Equipment abandoned in the flames began cooking off. Ammunition stored in bunkers detonated as fire penetrated storage areas. Artillery shells in prepared firing positions exploded as the heat reached critical levels. What had been a carefully prepared defensive position had become chaos. The third wave of American aircraft concentrated on the ridge crest itself, where Japanese command and communication facilities were located. Intelligence officers had identified likely locations for headquarters bunkers and radio positions. The napalm strikes on these areas were particularly devastating because the structures tended to have more extensive underground components with multiple chambers connected by tunnels. When fire penetrated these complexes, the tunnel systems became chimneys that drew the flames and smoke deep underground. In Matsumoto's command bunker, the ventilation system that had been carefully engineered to provide fresh air began pulling in smoke instead. Within minutes, the bunker became untenable. Matsumoto ordered evacuation, and he and his staff emerged from the bunker into a landscape transformed into hell. Trees were towers of flame. The ground itself seemed to be burning where napalm had dripped down through the canopy. The air was so hot it hurt to breathe. Visibility was measured in meters through the smoke. Matsumoto tried to organize his staff to move to an alternate command post, but the location he had designated was itself engulfed in flames. They stumbled through the burning forest, joining streams of soldiers from various units all attempting to escape the conflagration. American forward observers watching the strike from distant ridges reported results that exceeded expectations. The entire target area was burning with an intensity visible from kilometers away. Secondary explosions continued for hours as Japanese ammunition stores detonated. The smoke column rose so high it was visible from American headquarters positions 30 kilometers distant. What the observers could not see was the human cost of the attack occurring beneath the smoke and flames. Japanese casualties from this single strike would eventually be estimated at over 800 men killed. Some died from burns sustained attempting to escape the flames. More died from asphyxiation in caves and tunnels. Still others died from heat exposure or from the toxic effects of breathing superheated air and smoke. The survivors were scattered, disorganized, and psychologically shattered by an experience unlike anything in their training or previous combat experience. The success of the March 10 strike prompted immediate expansion of napalm employment throughout the northern Luzon campaign. Within days, every American fighter-bomber squadron operating in support of ground forces was receiving napalm ordnance. Tactical procedures were refined based on lessons learned from the initial strikes. Pilots discovered that multiple passes created more effective coverage than single large strikes. The persistence of napalm fires meant that successive waves could be spaced minutes apart, allowing the fire from earlier strikes to spread while new strikes extended the affected area. Target selection focused on areas where Japanese defensive concentrations had been identified through reconnaissance and intelligence. Priority targets included cave complexes, bunker lines along ridges, and heavily forested areas where Japanese troops were known to be staging for counterattacks. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers who survived napalm attacks described a terror fundamentally different from conventional bombardment. Artillery and bombs could be endured in fortified positions. Even direct hits, while terrifying, were instantaneous. Either you survived or you did not. Napalm was different. It crept and spread and persisted. It found its way into shelters. It consumed the oxygen and replaced it with toxic smoke. It created heat so intense that metal glowed and rock cracked. There was no way to fight it, no way to endure it through willpower, no way to demonstrate courage against an enemy that was not soldiers but chemistry and combustion. The defensive advantages that Japanese forces had relied upon, the caves and bunkers and dense jungle, were transformed from assets into liabilities. Fortified positions became death traps when fire penetrated the entrances. Dense vegetation that had provided concealment became fuel for fires that could not be extinguished. The interconnected tunnel systems that allowed defenders to shift positions became conduits for smoke and superheated air. By mid-March, American ground forces advancing along the Villa Verde Trail reported encountering defensive positions that had been abandoned without significant resistance. Investigation revealed that these were positions that had been struck by napalm attacks days or even weeks earlier. The fortifications themselves were often physically intact. Concrete bunkers showed scorch marks but remained structurally sound. Cave entrances were blackened by smoke but still accessible. But the positions were empty. Japanese defenders had withdrawn rather than occupy fortifications that they knew could be transformed into crematoriums by the next napalm strike. This represented a fundamental shift in Japanese defensive calculations. For the first time in the Pacific War, prepared defensive positions were being voluntarily abandoned not because they had been physically destroyed but because their tactical value had been negated by a weapon against which there was no effective defense. The scale of napalm employment grew steadily throughout March and into April. Strike missions that had initially involved squadron strength formations expanded to involve multiple squadrons coordinating attacks on target complexes. American air commanders began developing tactics specifically designed to maximize napalm effectiveness against fortified areas. One particularly effective technique was the box strike, where aircraft attacked from 4 directions in rapid succession, creating a box of fire that prevented defenders from escaping the affected area. Another was the rolling barrage, where successive waves of aircraft struck adjacent areas in sequence, creating a wall of fire that advanced across terrain like a slow-moving tsunami of flame. The logistical demands of these operations were substantial. Each napalm tank required approximately 140 gallons of gasoline plus the aluminum soap thickening agents. Mixing facilities at forward airfields operated around the clock to maintain adequate supplies. Quality control was critical because improperly mixed napalm could fail to ignite or burn too quickly without the desired adherence. Ground crews became expert at the mixing process, using heated stirring tanks to ensure the thickening agents fully dissolved in the gasoline. Japanese attempts to counter napalm attacks were largely ineffective. Anti-aircraft fire could disrupt attack runs and occasionally shoot down aircraft, but could not prevent strikes from occurring. Dispersing defensive positions reduced concentration of forces but also reduced defensive effectiveness. Some units attempted to create fire breaks around key positions by clearing vegetation, but the labor required was prohibitive and the cleared areas simply made positions more visible to aerial reconnaissance. The most common response was psychological rather than tactical. Units that had experienced napalm attacks became reluctant to occupy fortified positions, preferring to remain dispersed in the open where they were at least not trapped by fire. This undermined the entire Japanese defensive strategy, which depended on forcing American forces to attack prepared positions. By late April 1945, American forces had advanced significantly along the Villa Verde Trail and were reducing Japanese defensive positions throughout northern Luzon at a pace that would have been impossible without napalm support. The weapon had proven so effective that it was being employed not just as preparation for ground attacks but as a primary method of reducing fortified positions. Areas designated for attack would be subjected to multiple napalm strikes over several days, creating conditions where Japanese defenders either withdrew or were so degraded that subsequent ground advances met minimal resistance. The human cost of this new form of warfare was staggering on the Japanese side. Casualty reports from units that survived napalm attacks consistently showed that killed-to-wounded ratios were far higher than from conventional attacks. This was because napalm killed through fire, heat, and asphyxiation, effects against which there were few survivors. Soldiers either escaped the affected area largely unharmed or they died. There was no middle ground of wounded who could be evacuated and treated. Medical personnel attached to Japanese units reported being overwhelmed by burn casualties in the immediate aftermath of napalm strikes. Treatment options were extremely limited. Burn dressings were in short supply. Intravenous fluids for treating shock were essentially unavailable. Pain medication was almost non-existent. Most seriously burned soldiers died within hours or days of their injuries. Those who survived the initial wounds often succumbed to infections that developed in burn areas with no effective antibiotics available. The morale impact extended beyond units directly attacked. Japanese soldiers throughout northern Luzon heard accounts of napalm strikes from survivors and from rumors that spread through the defensive network. The psychological effect of knowing that at any moment aircraft could appear and transform your position into an inferno created a level of stress and anxiety that conventional bombardment did not produce. Soldiers began spending less time in fortified positions, preferring to remain outside where they could at least see an attack coming and attempt to flee. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.